Welcome to the interview. With me today are two very special guests. From London, joining us is Amish Tripathi. He calls himself Amish now, but I can't get rid of the Tripathi when I refer to him. And Bhavna Roy, authors of the new best-selling book Dharm: Decoding the Epics for a Meaningful Life. Here it is. This is the book, and it's a new book. It's already a bestseller. Amish and Bhavna, welcome to Beyond, and many congratulations on the success of your book.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Palki. Absolute pleasure being here.
Thank you, Palki. Lovely being here.
I've said this before, Amish, and I'll say this again. This, I believe, is your best book yet. What made you switch from mythological tales to interpretation of these characters?
Firstly, I should clarify, it's not just my book, it's Didi's and my book.
Yes.
And, I think Didi can expand much better on this. But the key thing is that the stories of our itihasas and our Puranas, they were never just stories by themselves, the way our ancestors saw it. For them, the stories were merely a wrapper for philosophies that could convey philosophies, essentially. They were a carrier for philosophies. That was the main purpose of these stories. And one of the key things our ancestors believed, that philosophies are not just something which are there for mental calisthenics, or not just something to be relegated to the humanities stream in graduation. Kuch to padh ke graduate kar lo. Philosophies was something that was taught to everyone, because essentially being a philosophical person is knowing the art of living, of how to live your life. Because all of us are confronted with challenges. How do we make the choices that help us confront those challenges is what defines our life, right? Life is not always about what happens to you. It is about how you react to what happens to you. Didi, if you want to...
Indeed. Indeed, I think I see Bhavna's contribution. I see expert psychoanalysis of some characters, and I believe that's Bhavna Roy through and through.
Actually, Palki, there I will correct you because, since 2004-5, I think, Amish's stories have been the dinner table conversation 7 out of 10 times in our family. He began writing in 2004-5. His first book was published in 2010. This is around 2013-14 really, because at the time I remember his series were out, Meluha Nagas, and we were having a conversation, the entire family, ID worship, the philosophical basis of ID worship, using Amish's 3 books at the time. And my brother at the end of the dinner conversation said, why don't the two of you start writing about the philosophies behind Amish's books? What happened thereafter was really I got down to creating the first draft, which is like I said, was 2013-14. I wrote around 20 pages and I sent them to Amish. He's 8 years younger to me, very, very deferential and respectful. I used to be a bit of a bully in our childhood. So he's always been gingerly around me. So in a very gingerly fashion, he said to me, Didi, this is too theoretical. This is not readable. This is not happening. So I said, all right, what should I do? He said, let me work on it. And then what he did, Palki, is he entirely rejigged the thing and infused the Amish magic in the philosophy, because he created these characters really. He converted it into conversations, and suddenly there were points and counterpoints, and his initial characters were initially driven towards discussing the philosophy. He sent them back to me and it was so enlivened. I worked on it, I sent it back to him, he worked on it, and there we have something, if I may say so myself, riveting because of these 4 characters.
Right, right. In fact, I can share a story myself. You know, as I was reading this book and I was talking to my mother and I was talking to her about Karn and Kumbhakarn, all the parallels that you draw. And she said that had you paid any attention to all the Bhagavad Kathas I took you to, you wouldn't have needed this book. But I think when you talk about the Amish magic or the way he tells a story, I think Amish, that's been your forte, to make mythology and to make all of these things that we've always known, but to relate to them better and make them cool, if I may.
Okay, I'm suitably embarrassed by the compliments for the two women here. Thank you so much. But the key thing is, I'd love to say that that it was an innovation from me to put it into a conversation. No, it isn't actually, because this is the tradition. This is our Upanishadic traditions. If you notice, most of practically all of our Upanishads, especially the main ones, they're always structured along conversations. They were never like the modern non-fiction books. So even the names, if you notice in the books, Dharmaraj, Nachiket, Lobamudra, Gargi, these are actually symbolic of the Upanishads, right? Because there are these characters in many of our Upanishads as well, the Katha Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. And the key benefit in a conversation as compared to a traditional non-fiction book is that you can present all sides. One of the key problems, I think, in the way the modern knowledge systems are, which are inspired more by the West, is that it is always driven by the standard non-fiction structure, wherein the author will make a hypothesis and then write an entire book to support that hypothesis. The natural corollary to this is tribalism, because they will just say my side is the right side and it is the truth. And of course, when it takes to an extreme, if you don't agree with the truth, you will go to hell, right? But whereas in the Upanishadic style, you'll have multiple sides, right? And you will discuss all of them and then leave it to the reader to come to his or her own conclusion. It is much more nuanced. It's very Indic, this style, and therefore you'll find something worth learning from, even from an opposing side. It's a fundamentally different approach to knowledge as compared to the Western, Middle Eastern approach, which is very much my right is the right side and you are wrong for disagreeing with me. So that's why I like the structure of conversations. It opens your mind a lot more.
And God knows we could do with more nuance in our conversations on every platform. Let me quote from your book. You say, thanks to our education in elite boarding and day schools, we grew up with an insider's view of the anglicized India of the time. It had its strengths, it had its beauty, it certainly had panache, but there was a subtle denigration of the Hindu way of life which often angered us. We kept quiet though. Amish, let me start with you. Do you believe that today's India is fundamentally different in this context from the India that you grew up in?
Oh yes, oh yes. I can tell you, our parents were educated in the Hindi medium. There no shortage of talent, but we know how difficult it was in pre-1991 India, especially if you didn't know English well. Didi is the eldest, my sister, and my parents, especially my mother, decided that we will not suffer what they suffered. And she was very, very conscious. तुम लोग ये अंग्रेजी वालों के सामने सहमोगे नहीं. You will not be intimidated by them, which means that you will grow up with them. And they sent us to schools that was way beyond their income and social class. I'll tell you the first school, Didi, I hope you don't mind my saying this, when Ma took Didi to the school, they weren't allowing Ma in, right? Because they were assuming that she's a servant, and my mother was crying outside that I will not go till my daughter is allowed in and you at least look at her. These things get seared into our consciousness, right? There's like a bit of anger, not anger, you would say, but perhaps a chip on the shoulder, all right? But at the same time, we found it's not, since we grew up with them in school, but at home we were deeply traditional. We made friends on that side too, and we said, yes, okay, there's decency in that side as well. But what really used to, I guess, irritate us is the almost ever-present denigration of our traditional way of life, of the Hindu way of life. And one of the things we learned from Ma early on is, and she used to quote Lord Krishna to us, that fight from a position of strength. So there is no need to fight right now. You focus on strengthening yourself first. And remember, in those days, at least the way it appeared was, if you didn't become a part of this anglicized world, you will remain uh, poor and left behind, right? So she said, you will learn their ways of life, but you'll not forget who you are at home. At home, we will remember who we are. We will know our traditions. We will practice them. We will know our scriptures. We will know everything. Outside, you learn their ways so that you can succeed in their world as well. And she used to always tell us, be like Lord Krishna. Learn how to fight, when, and what battle. In fact, actually, I think we wrote that in the introduction.
Yes, yes, it's been written there. Bhavna Roy, do you agree with this, that we have changed as a society, and that this has a subtle denigration of the Hindu way of life, as you put it, given way to something else? And what is it?
It's a process. We are certainly much further on the trajectory of being comfortable in our own skin and in our own Hindu ancient ethos than we were when we were children. Amish mentioned that childhood incident. The reason why my mom was not allowed entry with me beside her was because she spoke Hindi. She did not speak a word of English. And somehow not knowing English was, you were meant to be elsewhere. Your child cannot aspire to be in a school like this. So certainly there was an Hindi or Marathi, Kannada, Malayalam, all our regional languages were considered very subtly infra-dig. We preferred to in fact, in the best of homes today, we speak in English. There is a mixture, of our own languages, and English too is our own language. It's been around, us for over 2 centuries. English too is our language, but this being comfortable in the skin of our own culture is certainly a phenomenon that is developing. It has arrived in India, and it can only move ahead.
I guess as we grow in our as we experience a sense of success, one of the things I had read in Sanjeev Sanyal's Indian Renaissance, that our true independence actually started with 1991, not with 1947, because after centuries of decline, we start with the economic reforms. We started experiencing success once again, and we became comfortable in our own skin. And often actually being submissive or being unnecessarily aggressive are both a sign of insecurity. If you're actually comfortable in your own skin, you'll be strong, but you'll not be unnecessarily aggressive either, because there's no need for it, right? But you'll not be submissive either. You'll stand up for who you are. I think we are slowly getting there. Slowly, it's still a process. The younger generation is far more confident than we were. And with Lord Shiva's grace, maybe the generation after that, we'll be back to how we were 1,000 years ago, the most influential culture in the world.
Balki, if we add a point to this, Amish and I are working on that project is also almost complete. A book on, there's going to be a Dharma series, and we're going to write a book on idol worship. Argue the philosophical basis of idol worship front foot. It is not intra-dig, it is not unintelligent.
It is so beautiful. Why Murti Puja is so beautiful.
There is a very thought through philosophical basis, and there is beauty. There is archetypal beauty in idol worshipping. So, to own these things confidently.
Right. Right, that's a very interesting point you made. I'll come back to the point of language. Language is a very important part of culture, and India has hundreds of native languages. But most of India is trying to master the one language which was not native to India, which you say now we're all conversing in that language. Your book is in that language. So when you talk about preserving Indian culture, where does language feature in that endeavor? Amish, let's start with you.
Language is a very, very critical part of it, because language has a cultural essence as well. So for us, for example, we are very comfortable with Hindi as well. You would have seen interviews of mine in Hindi, for example. We have no issues at all because at home we spoke in that language. We understand Marathi reasonably well. Didi understands Gujarati also a lot better. And there is a culture to every language. I made this point in a series of tweets once, that I don't know if you notice, but that in English, the one male god is written with a capital G. The female goddess is written with a small g. It's a very subtle thing, but it shows that in the culture in which English emerged, male god superior, female goddess inferior. And this comes in as a subtle message through the way the language is conveyed. In Sanskrit or in Hindi or in most Indian languages, there is no differentiation between the male god and the female goddess. It's a subtle difference. Many of these things actually kind of go inside you, right? Sanskrit is the only language among the classical ones which actually has a third gender, right? Napunsak gender, which is different from the no gender of English. Okay, it recognizes a third gender. Again, this shows the culture that the language emerged from. If we speak in our own language, many of these things just go instinctively inside us. I am not anti-English, right? We were educated in English, and one of the keys, I mean, I'm glad our parents did that. Because of that, we got better jobs. I had gone for a seminar in Lucknow by a very large Hindi. Am I allowed to name other media houses out here? Or is okay? So Dainik Jagran, and I was speaking in Hindi, and one of the guys in the audience asked me, "Your Hindi is perfect. You didn't use one English word. Why don't you write in Hindi?" And then I countered him, saying, "You tell me honestly, if I did it in Hindi, would you have called me for the keynote speech out here? Or have you called me just because I've written in English and my books are therefore read across the country?" And he said, "Yes, that is sad but true." So I am not suggesting that we don't learn English, right? We need a good job. But English is the language of the stomach. The language of our heart is our own language that we must learn and master. We should not forget our own language, no matter what it is. Could be Hindi, Marathi, whatever your own language is, you must learn it.
Very well put. Let me quote again from the book, Bhavna. You say that you learn to straddle the two worlds, Shakespeare in school, Kalidas at home, George Bernard Shaw in school, Mahabharata and Ramayana at home, and so on, Bible in school, Gita, Upanishads at home, the Beatles and Lata Mangeshkar both at school and home. Would you have it any other way if you had the chance to revisit that period?
I would have it no other way. I wanted to, and I will exemplify that point by carrying. I'll combine your previous and the current question to give you my answer. Besides the best jobs, and English taking care of the stomach, which I'm in complete agreement with. The point that Amish made. I'm happy to also enjoy Shakespeare and Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge, Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Very comfortable with that aspect of, our reality as well. As for languages and the beauty of, our Indian languages, as Amish was speaking, what struck me is this family palki, Nachiket and Gargi Sawant and Dhanraj and Lopamudra Deshpande. They had to be Maharashtrian. They have to be Marathi speaking. The three of us are from UP. Could this family have been from UP? I don't think so. There is that beautiful relationship between the father-in-law and the son-in-law. UP would have been more father-son, more mother-daughter. That beautiful quintessential relationship that strikes so truthfully between Dharmraj and Nachiket had to be based in Pune. This family had to be Marathi. And that is the flavor of Marathi, and there is the flavor of Malayalam, of Tamil, of Bengal. That is the beauty of India. Each language has its flavor, each language has its culture. So does English, which makes the beautiful bouquet that is our beloved India.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'll come to my favorite part of the book, which was quite in the beginning, and it took me by surprise, Amish. The first chapter very interestingly talks about the dharma of the Communist Party of China versus the dharma of the dissidents. And the argument being made is very interesting. I would like to share it with our viewers, that the CCP has pulled millions out of poverty. It's a political party, so its dharma is basically to keep power and to remain in power. So what is your interpretation, Amish? Is the Communist Party of China following Swadharma?
Ooh, okay. You do realize I'm a diplomat, so I have to be a little careful.
No, don't be a diplomat.
Look, it's like this. I will not judge a nation that decides that the best way to manage itself is a top-down approach. Their choice, right? But would I much rather have a a top-down approach which is more sensitive towards its own people? Yes, and that is my outlook in life. And this I will say in the most careful way possible. They have certainly pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, which is good. But I am at my core an Indian, which makes me a Democrat and a liberal. And I think the key moral question of the next generation, of the next 20, 25 years, is how all of us within different democratic countries and across democracies work with each other to manage a power which in many ways is very troubling and scary in the way it runs things. Whatever our concerns with the West, and I certainly criticize elite Western journalists when they come out with their bizarre ivory tower analyses, but one would much rather live in a world where the power is with such countries rather than one which puts millions of its residents in concentration camps and harvests organs while they are still alive. That is deeply scary. So the thought that I have, which I've conveyed a few times, that perhaps within democracies and across democracies, we need to take a step back from our what appears like silly small fights between left and right and between different democracies when we are confronted with such a troubling scenario. We need to look at the bigger issue that exists and learn how to work together. And which is why for me, India succeeding is one of the most important messages for the next 20 years, because the impression around the world is democracies can't get things done. And India, we are a democracy, but we've managed the COVID pandemic reasonably well. Okay. Despite being, a massive country, we have more people in India than all of North America, all of Europe, all of Middle East combined. We can show that democracies can get things done. And there is a value to freedom, liberalism, and democracy. Therefore, India's success is a very important message. And to my friends in the West, because I know we think the left-right fight in India is scary. It's not actually. We are relatively decent. How you see it in the West, it truly is. I mean, they really need to take a step back because there's an authoritarian country eating their lunch and they're engaged in silly fights, internal fights with each other. They really need to take a step back. That's a thought I would leave in the most diplomatic way possible.
Absolutely, and you call yourself a liberal, which, by the way, is used as a pejorative in some parts, in some circles in India too. But I'm happy that you've said it in so many
Let
words.
me, okay, I'll tell you what, let me use the
Don't
Hindi word
explain
for it.
yourself.
Let me use the Hindi word for it, udar. There is no pejorative with udar. Udar is a beautiful concept.
Okay, you've saved yourself. Another, another line that stuck with me from the book is loyalty is a slippery slope. Bhavna, it is true. Can you explain it in India's political context?
No, we never speak on politics, but maybe on the mythological concept. Nice try, Palki.
I'm not going to go
That's-
in the political direction, but loyalty, yes. In its essence, loyalty is a beautiful concept, especially when it's based on love. Loving loyalty is indeed beautiful. All kinds of loyalty can be very, very questionable. Unquestioning loyalty can land you in trouble. Loyalty based on fear is ugly. So if loyalty based on fear is ugly, is disloyalty, does disloyalty have a case? Disloyalty can prove to be useful, even productive, but then disloyalty can never be beautiful. Beauty has its own essence. Um, Shorn of everything, nothing is absolute. So long as everything is examined, questioned, and embraced with consciousness and an awareness of consequences. All said and done, loving loyalty is something I root for all the time.
And let me just add to this from examples. Karna's loyalty to Duryodhan he was loyal, but it wasn't in Karna's interest. It wasn't even in Duryodhan's interest. Kumbhakarna's loyalty to Ravan, he was still loyal, but unlike Karna, Kumbhakarna wasn't blind to Ravan's faults, and he tried his best to keep improving Ravan, but he still remained loyal to his elder brother. There's a bit more beauty in that. Parvateshwar's loyalty to Lord Shiva, it was very easy for him because Lord Shiva was worthy of being loyal to. Now that is beautiful loyalty. Yeah? So there's the entire spectrum.
Yes, yes. Before I end, I want to ask you, each one of you, your learning from this pandemic. It's given everyone enough time to sit with themselves and reflect and think about life and what it has given us. What have you learned, Amish?
I think my learning comes even more because I am in London. And one of the things one has seen in the West and in London, where liberalism has unfortunately got, attached to the left. And the left has attacked almost every single tradition in the West. Now, when you destroy every tradition, you destroy the sense of family, you destroy the sense of community. All you're left with is loneliness, right? In the UK, they actually had a minister of loneliness. I kid you not. They actually, because it was that serious a problem. Because there are health issues, mental health issues, physical health issues, right? And in a pandemic like this, you're confronted with the problem because if most individuals in a society are lonely, if there are very few community bonds, nothing with your neighbors, the society isn't robust, it isn't tough, it can't handle issues like this. Whereas in India, there is a downside. Everyone will interfere in your life. Your neighbor will ask you 25 questions on why you're going early, why you're coming late, etc., etc. But the upside of that is in a pandemic like this, you are never alone. In the UK, in the US, we've heard so many cases of people who have literally died alone, and no one even knows. You know, how sad is that? So there is again, from the ancient Indian wisdom, have a sense of balance. Ati sarvatra varjayet. Extremism of any kind is not good. So if you are so traditional that there's no space for liberalism, no space for women's rights, no space for LGBT rights, that's not good. But if you swing to the other extreme, where there's no sense of community, no sense of family, you're completely alone, that's not good either, because then your society isn't strong enough to handle, problems such as those that arise with this pandemic.
Correct. Bhavna, you're learning.
The COVID period has been a period of complete learning for me. I have been able to action concepts that remained in my head till this point, which is learning how to live with rhythm, complete rhythm. Wake up at the same time every day, your meal times, your exercise times, your work times. I mastered it during this period. Living with discipline, understanding the value of work. Work is an extremely important element of creating a meaningful life.
It was very nice talking to you. I think I've known Amish for almost a decade, but it was good to have you on the show and to speak to you, and look forward to the next book in the Dharma series. I'm assuming there are more coming. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.